Start by playing a tune? Playing a little bit?
Sure, a couple chords.
Play a couple chords.
Turn it around.
Hi, I'm Teja Gerken with Peghead Nation, and I'm here with Andy Powers at Taylor Guitars headquarters in El Cajon, California. How are you doing, Andy?
And I'm doing well.
So
I'm glad
fun to
you're
be
here.
back here. It's been 5 years since I've visited you guys, and what better way to start than to play a little blue bossa on what's shaking out to be a little rainy day here in the San Diego area.
It's a perfect rainy day song, man.
Right? So I've been super excited to see all these new guitars coming from you guys. I've had a chance to demo both the new 700s with the Koa and the 500s with the Ironbark.
Right.
And congrats on those new models. And congrats to your new position here at Taylor, being the CEO and president, correct?
Yeah.
And chief designer. Okay.
And sometimes I do the dishes.
And sometimes you do the dishes.
trash
Anyway, it's
out.
my first time I've seen you since all that has gone down. So that's really awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about these urban woods that you've started to use.
Right, okay.
On the Ironbarks especially. I know you started with the ash on some of the other guitars. And perhaps we'll talk a little bit about the Koa. That's kind of a different type of Koa you're using on these guitars. But I think this urban Ironbark you're using on these is a really exciting wood.
You know what? It is. That was a wood that was, I guess it was kind of part of my first taste testing. Right? So we started playing with this idea of urban wood.
Yeah.
Bob and Scott Paul and I go, well, what could we do? What could we do with this?
Right.
Like there's trees all around us. Couldn't we do something?
Yep.
Like, okay, let's put a fresh hat on, fresh set of glasses, and go, well, that tree's big enough. What's that one?
Yep.
I don't know. So, and it's, in a way, it's almost an embarrassment.
Right.
As a woodworker to go, well, do I know some of these woods that are right around me? Like maybe this isn't as clear as I thought it was.
Right.
Okay, there's eucalyptus. How many different kinds? Well, turns out there's hundreds. There's a zillion different ones.
Right.
And they're just outside of my frame of reference as a traditional guitar would. So we started diving into this and working with West Coast Arborists. We were introduced to them and started to talk about, well, there's got to be something here.
Yep.
We got to do something.
Yeah.
And so we took chainsaws up to a log yard.
Yep.
Went and literally walking up and down piles of lumber going, well, what about that one? Tell me about that.
Yeah.
What's this like? And it felt very much like being a chef at a farmer's market. Go, I don't know what this thing is. What can I do with this?
Yeah.
What does this taste like? Do I cook it? Do I eat it raw? Do I, how do you work with this one? You know?
That's awesome.
And so a lot of these woods I brought back here to the shop, urban ironbark, or what we know now as urban ironbark, that was in that initial taste test. And it took me several years to get really familiar with it because it was, as far as I knew, for a really dense wood, it was an outlier.
Yeah.
It didn't do what I expected ultra dense woods to do. So if I were to make a short list of some common, what I'd call ultra dense woods, ebony being one of them, hunter and rosewood, I guess most of the tropical rosewoods.
Yeah.
Cocobolo would be in that category.
Super dense, yeah.
Super dense, and they tend to be oily. They tend to be very crack prone. They tend to be difficult to dry, very difficult to work with. So I was kind of stepping in slow to go, well, I got this sample. Let me see if I can first not ruin it by drying it improperly or hustling it along too far or whatever. So the more I learned about this wood, the more surprised I became to go, well, this stuff is so hard and so dense, and yet it has these really unique working characteristics, really unique tonal characteristics. It was a bit of a head scratcher. It took me a little while to figure out, gee, there's something here to this. I like this.
So when we talk about density in a wood, you've mentioned, I've read some of the articles that you guys put out in the Wood and Steel, which I recommend for people to check out as well. For people who may not be so familiar with the actual qualities of the woods, how would you describe the effect the density has on the tone of a guitar?
Well, that's a good question because it's not always a straightforward answer.
Right.
Okay. Because density tends to be heavy, right? It's a combination of hardness, how much does it weigh versus how much volume is there. Right. Volume as in physical space, not volume as in sound projection. Yeah. And so oftentimes a very dense wood has a high degree of what you would call damping. So if you introduce energy in the form of vibration into it, it will absorb some of that just by virtue of it being so heavy. It's like you got to put a lot of work in to get this thing moving. Right. I mean, imagine going behind like a big old farm truck and start to push that thing. Yeah. It's going to take a lot of pushing before you get it moving. Yeah. You're going to absorb a lot of energy. Yeah. Heavy, dense woods tend to do that. Yeah. Okay, if you were to walk up behind something very lightweight, like a Volkswagen Bug, it doesn't weigh very much. Right. A single person can get that thing rolling. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so a lightweight wood will be set in motion very easily and will tend to reflect that, but it also loses its momentum very quickly. Right? You get something heavy, you got this momentum, it's going to be hard to set in motion, hard to stop in motion. Right, and that was one of the things that I noticed when I was demoing both of these new 500s is the sustain that the guitars have. There's that giving back what you put into it, kind of a quality to that wood. Yeah, and now that's really interesting because the sustain is the length of the length that the string or the note will stay in motion. Yeah. That's got a thing. Yeah. But the way that a musician perceives it often is a bit of a mix. Yeah. Because sometimes we'll hear this long-lasting, beautiful note, and we'll think, well, it's got great volume. Yeah. Well, that's a measure of amplitude. Right. Like how far does the string move? How much air is displaced? How even projection, we'll confuse it with that, is how far does the sound go and I can still hear it. Yeah. Yeah. And so our experience as a player, it doesn't always, it's not always adequately explained by what we think, like the measurements of that, but it's what we feel. How musical does it become? Yeah. How effective is it or expressive is it under your fingertips? Right. And of course, there's the experience as the player and the experience as the listener. And depending on what kind of playing you do, that is a factor to think about. Do you want your audience to sort of get the best qualities of the guitar, or do you, as the player, want to hear those qualities? I want it all.
You want it all, of course. So we talked a little bit about this earlier, but one thing that I find really interesting, we all have sort of preconceived notions of, a rosewood guitar sounds like this, a mahogany guitar sounds like this, a maple guitar sounds like that. And of course, there are always some grains of truth to that. Woods have certain characteristics, and they're going to be part of that sort of recipe. But how much do you think, as the designer, or well, first of all, you as the designer, but also just the design of the guitar in general, how much control over the sound is the design of the instrument and the way it's built versus the materials that are used?
Right. Okay. So that's a good question because to me, I think of it as like a mix between ingredients and recipe. Right. Right. So you've got an ingredient, and it'll have a certain characteristic. Yep. But depending on the context that you put it in, it might be radically different. Okay. Let's go to extremes to make the point. Yep. You take East Indian rosewood. We think of it as having this bell-like sound, almost like a smiley face EQ curve. Very clear, crystalline low-end power, very clear bell-like high-end response. Okay, what happens if you put it in the form of a Telecaster, like George Harrison's famous Telecaster? Yeah. Well, could I compare that to a rosewood acoustic guitar? Not easily. No. Right? Those are two radically different kinds of sounds, even though it's a similar ingredient. Yeah. Right? And so in the form of an acoustic guitar, we want to look at this and go, well, yeah, the material will have some influence. It's got a personality. Right. It's got a set of characteristics. Then what do you do with it? Yeah. How do you shape it? How do you brace it? Is it a big guitar? Is it a small guitar? What do the curves of the guitar do to it? Yeah. How thick do you make the part? Like if we're talking about the back of a guitar,
Yeah.
how thick is it? How flexible is it?
Yeah.
How much torsion do you bend into it?
Yeah.
Like the back of even the top of a flat top guitar, it's not really flat.
Yeah.
Right?
No, of course. It's got a slight arch to it.
There's a slight arch
to it. The radius, as we call it usually. Yeah.
Right. And that has a similar effect to like it's the same kind of thing that happens when if you've ever seen a person play a musical saw blade.
Right.
Right.
And
You see a person with a handsaw and they've got a bow and they want to make a high pitch and they flex it a lot because it increases the rigidity and then therefore puts the resonant frequency up really high.
Yeah.
You can do all kinds of things with one piece of wood to change its characteristics.
Yeah.
And so that's true in an acoustic guitar where you're hearing like the combination of all of these variables. They all matter, but the builder does have a high degree of control over what they want to execute with that particular material.
Right. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. That's very cool.
That's why something like this 700 series guitar.
Right.
Okay, this is an interesting example because we build a Koa series guitar.
Yeah.
We'll call it let's say a K24.
Yeah.
It's got a solid Koa top, solid Koa back and sides. You put that next to this 724, even though they're the same basic material. But the combination of the back bracing, the thickness of the wood, the finish, even amongst a guitar with the same perimeter, the same shape, same silhouette.
Yeah.
It has a very different voice.
Very different sound. Absolutely. When I first checked these guitars out, there's a much more sort of lively response to these guitars than what I didn't play this side by side to a Koa series guitar when I did my Peghead Nation demo, but that was sort of my first reaction to it. It's like, oh, I don't remember these being that sort of flexible in their tonality and dynamic in their
It's
tonality.
a very direct sound. It's in some ways more player reflective.
Right.
So if you play it bright or you play it and lean into it like you were playing a gypsy jazz song or something, it's got this vibrancy that's undeniable.
Totally.
If you compare that to, say, a Koa series guitar, where the sound is just polished.
Yeah.
It's like so smooth, so refined. It's, for someone like me, it feels like a very gracious guitar.
Right.
Because I can play it and it just sounds smooth when it's done, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can have similar materials, even with similar variables in terms of the shape of the guitar, maybe even the shape of the top or the back, and then you make a few small bracing changes. You change the finish and the damping element that you put into that.
Right.
And wow, my experience as a player is a very different guitar.
Absolutely, yeah. And that experience as the player is really important. The feel of the guitar, the way we perceive the guitar. I think in some ways the woods can even affect the playability of the guitar.
Oh, very
in terms
much.
of the flexibility, the flexibility of the top and the neck and everything like that. Suddenly you have exact same specs and exact same setup, and yet one guitar will feel very different from another.
That's very true. I mean, and if you kind of like think about it kind of in the left brain sense for a minute and dissect the guitar into all these little components. Yeah. You've got a neck that's acting like one leg of a tuning fork.
Right.
And you attach strings out to that thing. It's like out there flopping around as it vibrates.
Right.
You attach the other end of the string into the middle of this vibrating surface. Yeah. Well, neither point are stationary. The whole thing is in motion all over the place. Yeah. And so your sensation when you go to touch those strings is going to reflect how flexible is this neck? How flexible is this top? Yeah. How is the top articulating? Like all of those little things, they matter. They're hard to measure because
they all add up. They're little
very
tiny
small.
Things that all add up. I know, but
because of that, I'm not a huge fan of reducing an instrument to the sum of its specifications.
Exactly.
Right? That rarely describes the guitar in complete terms. Yeah. Because what I'm most interested in is how does it sound in a song? How does it feel?
Right.
What does it do for a player? Yeah. Like how do I hold this guitar versus that guitar? Well, this one make the strings feel this way.
Right.
And that makes me want to play this instead of that.
Different.
Right?
Exactly. For sure. Yeah.
And so these things that they sound like subtle distinctions, like these gradations between guitars, but at the end of the day, they matter.
Yeah,
They matter
sure.
to a player because it's going to draw your music one direction versus another.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome.